Today we're going to run through lots of rare cards from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan to work out which ones are worth your wild cards when it comes to crafting them. Welcome back to the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on any future videos like this. Today we're having a look at all these rares from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan with the perspective of what do you want to spend your wild cards on, and the way I work that out tends to be cards that are used, not just effective, but are used in multiple different deck types. So you might have, for instance, a rare or mythic card that's really good, but only in one deck. I wouldn't include that in this list. These are ones that if you craft them, even if you don't use it in the deck that you might originally intend to use it in, you can use it in other decks as well. So it can work in lots of different ways. So we're going to break them down one by one, going by colour, as quickly as we can for each one, because it adds up. There's about 40 here. So there are 40 here. So let's break it down, starting with the white card. So first of all, we have Get Lost. It's a 2-mana instant, destroys creatures, enchantments, and planeswalkers. It does give your opponent 2 map tokens, so if they have creatures left over, that can be a slight benefit to them. But for a 2-mana instant, destroy almost anything, has to be some downside, especially in white. So really good for control decks, but also probably really good for kind of aggro decks, because 2-mana destroy something, they don't have time to use their map tokens, or they might not want to, rather than, you know, the alternative of putting more blockers out. So pretty good in a few different ways, but you'll see a lot of that. We have Resplendent Angel. Now this one is kind of on the fence a little bit, because it's only really good in Angel decks or life gain decks, because it's a 3-mana 3/3 with flying, which is like, it's okay. You'd probably rather have a Steel Seraph if you didn't care about the life gain, because then at least that has some versatility, being able to cast for a bigger cost later on. But if you can gain 5 life in a turn, getting an extra 4/4 Angel, potentially every single turn, is a huge benefit. You can pay the 6 mana here to give it +2/+2 and lifelink, which is quite a big cost for that benefit, although giving you the extra 4/4 kind of balances out that cost as well. But if you can play this with, you know, a Boonbringer Valkyrie, so you can like gain 5 life every turn. If you have it with a Seraph Paragon, you can bring it back from the graveyard if it's not exiled. So yeah, and if you've got Giada Font of Hope, it's going to come in even bigger than just a 3/3 anyway. So there's lots of ways this can work out a lot better than just a 3/3 flyer. It is a mythic, so it's obviously got to have some extra benefit to it. And I've used this in like Angel-themed Explorer decks, and because of some cards coming up later on, creature-based tribal decks work out pretty well these days. So yeah, there's definitely a bit of chance to see this happening more in standard. Then we've got the Thousand Moon Smithy. It's a 4-mana artifact that creates a gnome soldier, which is a bit like a regal bunnycorn. It has power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts and or creatures you control, whereas the bunnycorn includes all non-land permanents. This is just artifacts and creatures, although most of the non-land permanents you have are likely to be artifacts or creatures. You might have an enchantment or two, you might have a planeswalker. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference compared to what you get from a bunnycorn. Well, this costs 4, and the reason why this costs more than a bunnycorn is because you can tap 5 artifacts and or creatures, and this is 1 artifact, so it's just this and 4 others, and then you can transform it into a land, which is ramp for one thing, but also pretty much whenever you cast a spell from then on, you're going to create another gnome soldier artifact creature token. Whenever you cast an artifact or creature spell using the mana produced by this, and you can pretty much do that every turn, I imagine, if you're using this in a deck with other artifacts that might need crafting, or just lots of creatures to go as wide as possible. You might even have potentially something that will untap this land, so you can do it twice in a turn. Maybe you could do it in some kind of control-y games, or other ramp games, that types of deck that can untap lands. Probably not as common, but it can be done. So loads of value you can get from the smithy. Okay, then we've got Ogre Attack, Deepest Foundation. It's a 6-mana 6/6 Vigilance, which doesn't do anything when it enters, which is the downside of it. But you can create 3 times as many creature tokens whenever you create any tokens. And white is really good for tokens, so you're going to have things like wedding announcement. It's going to be a lot better. If you have something crazy like rabble rousing, it's going to create a huge amount of creatures. But even if you just have it in more of a control game where you have planeswalkers that create token creatures, having an Elspeth or a Wandering Emperor or an Eternal Wanderer creating their like samurais, their creatures, going to create 3 every turn. It's going to be amazing. So it can really help with those. Also, there are other colors that work really well with tokens. So like green, having things like the Consuming Blob, making 3 of those every turn, or Gruff triplets, making the original Gruff triplet and 6 others instead of 2 others. Yeah, that's quite a lot of value from that kind of combo. And the other benefit, the fact it kind of balances out the fact it doesn't do anything when it enters, is that if it's not exiled, if it dies, it just turns into a land, and you can potentially just transform it back next turn. So yeah, that's pretty good. So loads of value you can get from that, even though it doesn't have an EDB effect. And then we've got Abuelo's Awakening. It's a 4-mana sorcery to return an artifact or non-aura enchantment from your graveyard to the battlefield, and you can put extra +1 counters on it if you pay the extra cost. But if you just play 4, then it comes back as a 1/1 spirit flying creature. So that's pretty good. And if you bring back on turn 4 something like a 1 with a multiverse, or a Portal to Phyrexia, or something really big like that, if your opponent can't deal with it straight away, they'll probably quit. A 1/1 isn't too difficult to deal with, but if they just happen to not have removal at the time, there's a good chance they'll quit pretty quickly. So although it's kind of fragile when it comes out, that can work pretty well. Okay, onto the blue cards. We have Malcolm, Alluring Scoundrel. It's a 2-mana flash 2/1 creature with flying, and whenever it does combat damage to a player, you put a chorus counter on it, you draw a card, you discard, and potentially, if you have 4 chorus counters, you can discard a card that you want to cast without paying its cost, maybe something really big, and you can get a big spell out there. Not bad, considering 2 mana, 2/1 flash and flying is quite a lot of value in itself. But being able to like fix your hand to draw and discard, to doing something with graveyard is even better. So much value you can get from Malcolm. Then we have Akal Pakal, First Among Equals. It's a 3-mana 1/5 creature. At the beginning of each player's end step, if an artifact entered the battlefield under your control, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand and 1 into the graveyard. So there's lots of ways we can produce artifacts, whether it's like treasure tokens, blood tokens, Mirrex creature tokens, which you can do on your opponent's turn. So you can get this on both players' end step. So you're going to really, really quickly fill up your hand with pretty much what you want, because you can pick from the 2. And yeah, it's going to really help you get what you need, especially in those longer games. And then we've got Kitesail Larcenist, a 3-mana 2/3 flying ward 1 pirates. That's quite a lot happening just for 3 mana. But also, when it enters, for each player, obviously in Arena that's just 1 opponent, but obviously yourself as well if you wanted to, you can choose up to 1 artifact or creature, and as long as the Kitesail Larcenist remains on the battlefield, those permanents become treasure artifacts with tap, sacrifice, add 1 mana, like any other treasure, and they lose all other abilities. So you can take out an opponent's massive creature that you want to get rid of. Maybe you've got something small that you'd rather turn into a treasure to ramp up as well, so you can do those. Or you could have, I think this works this way, I haven't used this one myself, but if you have this out and they kill Kitesail Larcenist, then whatever you've turned into a treasure should just turn back into a creature, and I presume it then also has an ETB effect again. I'll have to check that out, I'm not entirely sure. Let me know in the comments if you know, but you might want to turn something you have with a good ETB effect into a treasure, because if your opponent wants to kill the Larcenist and get their creature back, they're also going to get your creature re-entering. We'll have to check that one out, but if it does, that would be a really good way of using it. And then we've got Tishana's Tidebender, a 3-mana 3/2 flash merfolk wizard. When it enters the battlefield, like that's good in itself, right? A 3/2 flash 3-mana creature. But when it enters the battlefield, you can counter an activated or triggered ability. And if an ability of an artifact, creature, or planeswalker is countered this way, it loses all abilities for as long as Tishana's Tidebender remains on the battlefield. So imagine your opponent gets out a Liliana. That's the one that normally kind of locks me down and stops me being able to do anything I want. The opponent makes you discard something. You can then flash out Tishana, and you can counter that activated ability of the Planeswalker, and now Liliana can't do anything. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, it's great to be able to basically like effectively remove a Planeswalker or remove, let's see, what else would it have? A triggered ability would be like a Portal to Phyrexia, returning a creature to the battlefield. If you flash this out, then you can counter that triggered ability, and then it loses abilities, so it can't do that again. So it's really good to be able to take anything out effectively and make it stop working. Okay, then we've got Oja Patik, Deepest Epoch. It's a 4-mana, 4/3 flying god creature, and whenever you cast an instant from your hand, it gains rebound. When it dies, it becomes the land, like the other gods in Ixalan, and you can transform it back after 3 turns. You remove a time counter from it. It has 3 time counters, and then you can transform it back. So being able to rebound instants and sorceries is really, really good. Not sorceries, just instants. So you might have something like, Impulse. So you're drawing, a card from the top 4 of your deck, and then you get to do that again for free. Or you could do something like, I don't know, a Flow of Knowledge. Flow of Knowledge, is that the one? Where you draw cards equal to the number of islands you have, and then you do that again at the beginning of your next turn. Might be too many cards, but it's a lot of value you could get. Or even something like, or even just a removal spell, even if it's just a Go for the Throat and you get to do it again at the beginning of your next turn, is really good. So doubling up pretty much any instant you have is good value in itself. But also this works well with adventure cards, because if the adventure is an instant, then you can cast the instant, like with the Hornlock Whale. You can cast the instant on your opponent's turn. At the beginning of your turn, you get to play out the whale for free, rather than paying the 6 mana. And this also works with things like Virtue of Loyalty, because that is an instant adventure, and then you get to pay out the actual enchantment for free. So loads of value you can get from Batik. Okay, then we have Terratide onto the black cards. It's a 4-mana board wipe. All creatures get -X till end of turn, when X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. So obviously right at the beginning it's not going to do too much, but if you're milling cards, or if you have some small creatures that just die and go to the graveyard or are sacrificed, then this can do quite a lot of damage to creatures. And -X gets around things being indestructible. It also gets around things that trigger based on the amount of damage they take. So if your opponent has an Obliterator or a Vindicator, then it kills them, and they don't get their ability of redirecting damage or making you sacrifice things. So really good board wipe in black that basically covers everything. It might not get rid of your opponent's 8/8 early on, because you need to have lots of things in your graveyard, but later on in the game, it's just going to completely wipe everything out. So it's so good. Okay, then we have Bloodletter of Aklazot. It's a 4-mana, 2/4 flying vampire demon. Although when your opponent loses life during your turn, they lose twice that much. If you attack with this, although it's a 2/4, you're going to do 4 damage because you're doing twice as much damage. And anything else you have that happens to do lots of damage to your opponent is going to double. So that's pretty cool. So you might have anything like, a Lightning Strike just does 3 damage, there's now 6, or a Corrupt. And you might have, I don't know, let's say 6 Swamps out, and instead of doing 6 damage, it's doing 12. So huge value you can get from that. It's kind of hard to cast in anything other than black, but to be honest, there's so many decent lands in Standard right now that 5-color decks are so easy to cast things. I don't think it would be a problem, even if it's not in a mono black deck, as long as you have some of those rare lands. Alright, then we've got Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. The Black God himself. It's a 5-mana, 4/4 flying lifelink creature, and whenever it attacks, the opponent discards a card. When they can't, you draw a card, so you get the value even if they have an empty hand, and if they discard a land, which, tends to be the thing they're probably more likely to want to discard, as long as they have enough land out, so they don't want to get rid of their creatures and be stuck with just lands, well, you get to create an extra 1/1 black bat as well. And obviously when it dies, it turns into the land, and you can transform it back as long as the opponent only has 1 or fewer cards in the hand. And if you're discarding things, if it's a kind of discard deck, That's going to be really easy to bring back. But yeah, there's all kinds of ways you could use this. It's a really, really hard card to deal with because it can make you just discard things every time, especially when you have things like Liliana in the deck as well, because your opponent can make you discard lots of things with Liliana and then hit you with this. You might not have removal left over, and from then on, they're just drawing extra cards. So, loads of value from Aklazot's. It's going to be a really fun one to play with. And then moving on to the red cards, we have Inti, Seneschal of the Sun, a 2-mana 2/2 legendary human creature. Whenever you attack, not necessarily with Inti, but with anything, you can discard a card. When you do, you put a +1 counter on an attacking creature and give it trample. And whenever you discard one or more cards, like on the attack trigger, you can exile the top card of your library and play it up until your next end step. So basically, this turn, if you're attacking now and discarding, you could discard something on your opponent's turn, or at your current end step and have until your next turn to use that. But yeah, really good value. It's only a 2-mana 2/2 by the looks of it, but actually it adds +1 counters. It helps fix your hand. You can discard things you don't want. You can, exile more cards off the top, and you can put trample, so it's even relevant later on in the game as well. +1 counter is probably more relevant at the beginning when you're trying to push through the right amount of damage and deal with your opponent's blockers. And at the end, when you're putting trample on big creatures, even better. So loads of value you can get from that. We've got Brass's Tunnel Grinder, a 3-mana artifact. When it enters, you can discard any number of cards and then draw that many cards +1. At the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, which is putting a permanent card into the graveyard, you can put a counter on this, a bore counter, and if there are 3 or more, so you've done it 3 turns in a row, you can remove those counters and transform it. It becomes a land, which is ramp as well, which is really good. And whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana produced by this, you get to discover X, where X is that spell's mana value. So you could cast some huge things and get huge discover off that, which is basically getting 2 spells for free. Although it could be a cheap spell you get for free, or it could be a really expensive one. Even if you're discovering 10, you might get a 1-mana creature out. So, it's kind of random, but still getting that pretty much every turn is loads and loads of value. And also the fact that you can discard lots of things and draw that many cards +1 is basically helping you sift through your deck if you're looking for combo pieces, put things in your graveyard if you have value from the graveyard as well. So loads of things you can do with this, and it works well in lots of other formats as well. I think it's going to be pretty good in standard. Okay, then we have Breach's Eager Pillager, a 3-mana 3/3 first strike pirate. Whenever a pirate you control attacks, which could be Breaches or something else, you get to choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn between creating a treasure token, stopping one creature from blocking, or exiling the top of your library and playing it this turn. What's great about this is if you're attacking with 3 goblins, then you get all 3 pirates, not goblins, then you get all 3 of those triggers. You can make a treasure and stop a blocker and exile top cards from your library. And first strike's really useful against all kinds of other creatures as well. Pretty much stop your opponent from attacking, and you can be pretty aggressive with it as well. So it works really well, obviously in pirate-themed decks, also in other decks where you just want to, do as much damage as you can, hit with a first strike creature. Does pretty well with that as well. Helps you ramp, helps you get damage through, helps you draw more things off the top. Okay, then we have Oja Axonil Deepest Might. This is really cool. So it's a 4-mana 4/4 creature. It has trample, but I don't think that ever necessarily comes out. The most important thing is whenever you do non-combat damage with a red source you control, then it does damage equal to this creature's power instead. When it dies, you return it tapped and transformed as a land. And then when it's the land, you can transform it back if red sources you control dealt 4 or more non-combat damage this turn, and only as a sorcery. So if you have, any red thing that does damage, lightning strike, play with fire. You have an anvil, Oni called Anvil, which has red in it, doing damage. That's going to do 4 instead of 1. If you have an all will be 1, doing damage when you add +1 counters, it's going to do 4 damage instead. And what's even better is if you can increase Oja Axonil's power, it's not just going to do 4 damage when you do all these non-combat things, it's going to do whatever its power is. So if you double its power to 8, then every trigger that does any damage to the opponent is going to do 8 damage instead of 1, or whatever it would have done. So there's lots of things that make that really cool. Maybe even with a Thundering Raiju that could attack a +1 counter on Oja Axonil, and then the the Thundering Raiju then does 5 damage with its non-combat hit, and then it hits through and this has trample. That could do lots of damage too. Also, like I said, things like the Onicol Anvil do 4 damage or more every turn, and then things like Voldaren Epicure entering will do 4 damage when it enters. Or you can use those red creatures that do extra 1 damage whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, and they'll do lots more. So lots of things you can do with that to make a slightly different mono red deck, possibly, rather than the normal Swift Spear, Phoenix Chip, Kamano kind of mono red. Okay, then we have the Bonehold Dracosaur, a 5 mana 5/5 flying first strike, which is really good by itself, but also at the beginning of your upkeep, you can exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you can play them this turn. If you have a land there, you can create a dinosaur, a 3/1 dinosaur creature. If you exile a non-land, you get to create a treasure token. If you have 2 lands, you get 1 dinosaur. If you have 2 non-lands, you get 1 treasure. If you have a land and a non-land, then you get the dinosaur and a treasure. And obviously, if you have more Bonehold Dracosaurs, because they're not legendary, you're going to be exiling lots of things off the top of your library, so there's going to be loads of things you're able to cast, and the treasure helps you cast them a bit easier because you have the extra mana. So loads of value. Whenever you put this out, it has to be dealt with straight away. It's a bit like a shield red for the amount of value you get from it. If your opponent can't kill it when you put it out, you're probably going to win the game with this, because you're going to keep getting extra cards, extra creature, extra ramps. Loads of things you get from that. So a really, really fun creature. And then we have Trumpeting Carnosaur, one of my favourite dinosaurs from Ixalan, although Dracosaur maybe is better. The Trumpeting Dinosaur is a 6 mana 7/6 trample. When it enters, you get to discover 5. So you find anything for 5 mana or less from the top of your library. You can cast it for free or put it into your hand. And yeah, you can also use it as early removal. If you have too many in your hand at the early game, you can pay 3 to discard it and do 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker to help you survive a bit longer. Getting this into the graveyard could be useful for different decks as well. And there's some cool combos you can do with the Carnosaur based on the Discover 5 mechanic, which you may have seen in Standard, but also in Explorer decks. There are ways you can make good use of the Discover mechanic. We're going to have one budget deck using Carnosaur coming up very soon. So yeah, great creature, very versatile. Then we've got the Pugnacious Hammerskull, a 3 mana 6/6 dinosaur. Whenever it attacks, if you don't control another dinosaur, you put a stun counter on it. So you kind of want to use it with other dinosaurs. But even if you don't, you can use this in things like a fight rigging deck, because getting a 6/6 creature out on turn 3 is really good. It's in the same colors as fight rigging as well, so it's potentially better than having the Shakedown Heavy, which is the 3 mana creature that you'd probably normally use in a fight rigging deck. But also, yeah, anything that has other dinosaurs in it, you're going to be able to do lots of damage. Like, as soon as you're attacking with this, it doesn't have trample, but there are things you can do to give it trample. So definitely a creature that has to be dealt with soon. And if you can't attack with it, it's at least a really good blocker. So good in some combo things, good in some dinosaur synergy decks as well. And then we have the Hulking Raptor, another really good dinosaur. I really like dinosaurs in this set. We have a 4 mana 5/3 dinosaur with Ward 2, which is good. It's kind of hard to kill because of the ward. I find that the ward pay mana cost are better normally than the ward pay life. With a Flesh Gorger, the opponent has no problem killing it and paying the 3 life, because they would take 3 damage if they didn't kill it to start with. But this, the extra pay 2, they might not have enough to actually kill it, because it's either going to use up more of their mana on their turn and stop them from doing other things, or they just literally don't have enough mana to do it. So yeah, really, really good. Also, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you add 2 green mana. So it helps you ramp pretty well if it does survive till the next turn, and if it survives ongoing, it's loads of extra value you get from it. You're shutting down the opponent based on the amount of mana they have available, and you're increasing the amount of mana you have. So it really helps swing the game quite a lot. Okay, then we have Oja Kaslam, Deepest Growth, a 5 mana 6/5 trample god creature. It's the green god from Ixalan. When it does combat damage to a player, you can reveal that many cards from the top of your library and put a creature card and or a land card, so it could be both, onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So it's got trample, there's a good chance it's going to do combat damage, it can help ramp, it can help get extra creatures out without paying any mana cost, which could be potentially really big creatures, which you probably will have in a green heavy deck. But also, what green really needs right now is creatures that are resilient to being removed. So what's really great about this is it turns into land, and you can transform it back again as long as you control 10 or more permanents. So that includes lands. You're probably going to have at least 5 or 6 lands at the moment, and the Temple of Cultivation, this land, is a permanent. So if you have 5 to cast a creature, and that's 6 already, you only need a couple more things to be able to transform this back, so it's really not that difficult, especially if it's helped put out other creatures or lands when it's attacked and done damage. So possibly one of the cards that green really needs right now to be competitive again, because we don't see that much mono green, and it used to be really good. So also, something that really, really helps mono green out and makes creatures more resilient is the Skull Sport Nexus, 8 mana artifact, costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among other creatures you control. So green tends to have creatures with high power, like 5 or 6 here. Obviously, there's lots of other green cards that have high power as well. So this could just be a 2 mana thing to cast, which is amazing. And whenever one or more non-token creatures you control die, you create a Dinosaur creature token with base power and toughness equal to the total power of those creatures. And what's even better, if it's not enough, that you get to play out a Hammer Skull on turn 3 and then a Skull Spore Nexus on turn 4 that only costs 2 mana. And if the Hammer Skull dies, it gets replaced by another 6/6 Dinosaur. But you can pay 2 mana, which works out pretty well. You play this on turn 3, this on turn 4. You could tap it to double the Hammer Skull's power, make it a 12/12, or 12/6 in this case. And if it dies then, or if it's targeted with removal, you could then use this ability on it, make it a 12/6, and it dies and it gets replaced by a 12/12. So huge resilience in green creatures. That's what we need right now. The Skullspawn Nexus is a great way of doing that. Okay, then we have our colorless cards. The Millennium Calendar seems like a bit of a meme card because you need 1,000 counters on it to make the opponent lose 1,000 life, which is a bit crazy, and it takes, I don't know, 5 or 10 turns to get there. But it's used in lots of different decks. So you could use it in an infinite mana combo deck. You can tap and untap this by itself using Agatha's Soul Cauldron and things like that. Or you can use it alongside All Will Be One, because putting any number of counters on something does that much damage to any target apart from battles. So you could use this with that, or you can go with a more traditional maybe control deck that just stalls out the game and makes this an inevitable win condition eventually, as long as the opponent can't do very much. If you have counter spells to stop them destroying it, if you have other things to make it hexproof, then the opponent's going to die sooner or later. They're not going to gain 1,000 life to outrace this. If they can't get rid of it, then you're going to win eventually. So it's a fun card to use. A few different decks you can use it in. So I'd say it's one worth crafting and playing around with. Then we have Treasure Map. It's a 2 mana artifact where you can pay 1 and tap to scry 1. You put a landmark counter on this. If there are 3 or more, you get to remove those, transform this into a land, and also you get to create 3 treasure tokens. So the amount of value you get from paying 2 and paying 1 for each scry, only paying 5 mana in total for this to turn it into a land, and you get 3 treasure tokens back. So you're kind of getting a refund on the amount of mana you've invested into it. The scry is really useful in many instances as well. And also, you then get the treasure tokens to ramp if you want to cast something big. Or, if you don't need to cast anything big and you just need some more cards, and you can tap this land to sacrifice treasure and draw a card. And if you have a deck that makes lots of other treasures, you're going to be drawing loads of extra cards every turn, effectively for 1 mana or 2 mana, because you could use this for mana otherwise, you could use a treasure for mana otherwise. So technically you're tapping this, sacrificing a treasure, kind of like paying 2 mana to draw a card. But yeah, so it's really, really good in lots of decks to help you find combo pieces, or to help just sift through your deck to find the things you need and fix your hand. So really, really valuable artifact. Okay, then we have Roaming Throne. This one's really fun. It's a 4 mana 4/4 artifact creature. I like the fact it's an artifact because Go for the Throat is the most common removal at the moment, although it might be starting to shift, especially if things like this become even more popular. because it has Ward 2. When it enters, you choose a creature type. So if you're playing with, a Pirates deck, a Dinosaur deck, an Angel deck, whatever it might be, choose the creature type that you're using the most. And also humans, there's lots of things it can work with. So this becomes that type in addition to other types, and if a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time. So things like Adeline attacking, or something attacking when you have an Adeline on the field, makes the 1/1 creature. It's going to make two 1/1 creatures. If you have two roaming thrones out, the Ward 2, or Ward on any creature, is a triggered ability. So it actually becomes Ward 4 if you have two roaming thrones out. If you have the roaming throne out and a Phyrexian Flesh Gorger, and it's a Phyrexian based deck, and the roaming throne becomes a Phyrexian throne, then the ward pay life on the Flesh Gorger is going to be doubled as well. So all kinds of things, triggered abilities. Shieldred has a triggered ability when people draw cards. Loads of things it can do. So basically, any tribal or creature type based deck, you're going to want to include one or two of these at the very least, because it's going to just make all those triggered abilities so much better. So there's lots of things I want to try out with this, and I'm sure you do too. I'm sure it's a really good one, and if you're using a rare wild card to craft it, you won't be sorry about it. Okay, then we have Chimil, the Inner Sun. It's a 6-mana legendary artifact. Spells you control can't be countered, and at the beginning of your end step you get to discover 5. So, obviously, working much better in decks that are slower, that have more turns to get value out, more kind of mid-range or control-y decks rather than aggro decks. But being able to stop your spells being countered, and you can still counter the opponent's spells, and getting to discover 5 at the beginning of your end step every turn, and there are things you can do that can double the discover trigger, then that's huge amounts of value you can get from Chimil. Artifacts tend to be slightly harder to get rid of. I know there are things like a Braid that can get rid of them really easily. People don't tend to play them very much. So, even Get Lost is creature, enchantment, or planeswalker. So artifacts are still quite hard to get rid of sometimes. Loads of value you can get from that. Sure, you wouldn't be disappointed if you like to play slower decks like that. You're going to get loads of value from it. And the fact that these are colorless means they fit into pretty much any deck, so loads of value you can get from those. Then we have Threefold Thunderhulk, a 7-mana 0/0 creature that enters with +1 counters, so it becomes a 3/3 in itself and creates 3 other 1/1 gnomes. You can sacrifice other artifacts, put +1 counters on this, and when you attack, it creates more 1/1 gnomes equal to its power. Also, you could do things like double its power, so you get more triggers. You could have Ogre attack, which makes triple the creature tokens. There's all kinds of things you can do to go wide. I think it works really well with the smithy, because going wide is one thing that really helps those gnome creatures from the smithy get even better. Really good creature to have. It is 7 mana, which is not ideal, kind of expensive, but if you have the kind of deck that's going to go on long and build value over time, then this can get loads and loads of value for you. And like I said, artifacts, slightly harder to get rid of. If Go for the Throat is still one of the most popular black removal spells. So, I think you'll get a lot from that as well. Okay, so we're moving on to the multicolored cards. First of all, we have the Ancient one, so it's black and blue. It's an 8/8. It's only 2 mana for an 8/8. So although the Pugnacious Hammer Skull works really well with fight rigging, the Ancient one is even better, because if you can cast this on turn 2, although the mana colors are a little bit more difficult to manage, cast this on turn 2 and then cast the fight rigging on turn 3 if you have it. Then you have a fight rigging trigger on turn 3, which is as early as you can possibly do it. It's a good creature by itself, because if you can descend 8, which it isn't that difficult to kind of mill 4 cards at a time or more, and you have lots of permanents in there, it's quite a creature heavy deck, then there's a good chance you're going to get to descend 8 in just a couple of turns, and you're going to have an 8/8 pretty early on. Which is hard to remove for some colours, very hard to remove for red, very hard to remove for green, not necessarily so hard for other colours, but still it's pretty hard for those to deal with. And if you can get a fight rigging trigger off turn 3, then you're probably going to win the game, unless your opponent has something amazing to deal with that. So also being able to draw and discard and cause your opponent to mill or yourself to mill is a lot of value because you could use it in some kind of mill deck that tries to mill your opponent out as well. So yeah, loads of value from the Ancient one. Then we've got Molten Collapse. It's a 2-mana, black and red. It's a sorcery, and you can destroy target creature or planeswalker. So basically, kind of unconditional removal there, as long as you have the 2 colors, and the 2 colors that work really well together and are quite common. And you can also, if you have descended this turn, you can also destroy a target non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Now, there could be all kinds of things out there you want to destroy that are not creatures and not lands with mana value 1 or less. One might be the Millennium Calendar, but I'm sure there's lots of other ones that you could probably think of. But even if you couldn't, just a 2-mana destroy target creature or planeswalker is really good. It's a shame it's sorcery. It would be amazing if it was an instant. Still, Molten Collapse is really, really good for a very small cost. Then we've got Abuelo Ancestral Echo. It's a 3-mana 2/2 flying spirit creature with Ward 2, and it has this really cool ability for 3 mana to exile a creature or artifact you control, return it at the beginning of the next end step. So, anything with big ETB effects, anything that is being targeted by your opponent, they're trying to remove something, you can just exile it, return it at the beginning of the next end step. So, makes things very hard to kill. There's loads of value you can get from flickering things, from them leaving and returning as well. So yeah, and also having Ward 2, again, quite hard to kill. So that's a pretty cool thing to have in any deck. Then we have Squirming Emergence. Someone used this against me recently, and I was quite impressed with the fact it's only 3 mana to effectively return anything, any non-land permanent, from the graveyard to the battlefield. So if you have enough in your graveyard, this is 3 mana to reactivate or reanimate an Atraxa, a Portal to Phyrexia, a one with the multiverse, Tali, anything you can think of that's really big, any non-land permanent, as long as you have enough permanent cards in your graveyard. And you can throw lands away, you can mill really easily in black and blue, black and green. So loads of value you can get from that, returning all kinds of things with ETB effects or just things that are hard to get rid of. So in a heavy milling strategy, it works really well, but also just any kind of good green and black deck that happens to have, even their shield red in the graveyard, you can bring it back pretty easily. Then we have Anim Pakal, 1000th Moon. It's a 3-mana 1/2 creature, so it sounds like it's pretty small, but it has a very similar effect to Adeline. When you're attacking with non-gnome creatures, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Anim Pakal and create X plus X/1/1 gnome creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. It's a bit like Adeline, where X is a number of +1 counters on it. So if you can put other +1 counters on this, then you're going to make lots and lots of gnomes. Or even if you don't put the extra +1 counters on it, and you just attack each turn, making more gnomes each turn. But you have to attack with a non-gnome to trigger this. So in a human aggro deck with Adeline and with this, you're going to go so wide that the opponent won't be able to deal with it. So lots of value from that. But also, you can use it in other longer decks, slower decks, because you're going to get this value every turn. And then we've got Quintorius Cant. It's the only planeswalker in the set. It's a really good one. It's 5 mana, comes in with 4 loyalty, and when you cast a spell from exile, it does 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. There are lots of ways to cast spells from exile, so you can anything from like PNLR to just the Reckless Impulse, or Discover is casting things from exile, or Atali's ability, which is a bit like Discover, also casting from exile. But this can discover itself as well. Discover 4, the -3 cost, so it can do that 2 damage and 2 life gain whenever it discovers something. So that's really good. It also gets to, if you get to the -6 ability, it's really cool. You can exile target cards from your graveyard, add a red mana for each card exiled that way, and you get to play those cards this turn. So those cards are all exiled. It's any number of them. If there's loads of tiny spells, loads of play with fires, then you can add to red mana to basically cast any of those, and it's pretty much win the game. You're going to do lots of damage. You're going to gain lots of life from doing that. So yeah, you don't want to have Quintorius on 6 and then do -6, because when Quintorius goes, you won't have that passive ability, so you have to get to 7 to then do the -6. So if you can get there, that's pretty much game ending. And I like the planeswalkers that get to create a creature with their plus ability, because it means you can keep doing it every turn, and it kind of protects itself as well. So definitely a really good one to have in all kinds of white and red spell strategies. Also, just anything else with like PNLR, things like that. And then we've got the lands. So what's really cool is we've got all these 2-color lands: the Restless Anchorage, Restless Reef, Restless Fence, Restless Ridgeline, and Restless Prairie to go along with the Restless lands we got from the Wilds of Eldraine. So they all turn into creatures, they all get extra abilities. The blue and white makes a map token. The blue and black gets to mill someone, so works really well. Mill is getting pretty good at the moment. We've got black and red, becomes an insect, but when it attacks you can discard a card and draw a card. The green and red becomes a dinosaur that gives something else +2 until the end of turn and untaps it. And the green and white becomes a 3/3 creature. When it attacks other creatures you control, get +1/+1 until the end of turn, so really good if you have a really wide board. So they're all really good in different strategies, also just good for casting all those multicolored spells you might have. And then the other thing that makes creature type based decks really, really good is Cavern of Souls. You get to choose a creature type, and you can add 1 mana of any color to spend to cast a creature spell of that chosen type, and it cannot be countered. So if you have an angel deck, you name angels, none of your angels can be countered. It's great. If you have Phyrexians, if you have dinosaurs, if you have pirates, if you have vampires, whatever it might be, they cannot be countered, and you can use it as 1 mana of any color. So if it's something like an Atraxa, an angels, it helps you cast it as well, not just stopping it from being countered. But what's great about this is even if you don't have it in a specific creature type deck, if you have any ramp deck that happens to end with an Natali or happens to end with an Atraxa, you can name Dinosaur, you can name Angel, just to make sure that your best card doesn't get countered, even if even if it doesn't help your other things, other creatures in the deck. It's going to help at least the most important one not be countered. So I can see this happening a lot. I can see lots of people spending their mythic wildcards on getting this, and I can see it might make mono blue control a little bit worse, because counter spells become not quite as valuable against these creature decks. And yeah, we might see mono blue not used quite so much. So that's the 40 cards I'm running through. Try to do it as quickly as possible. So let me know what you think in the comments below about these cards. If you have any questions about how any of them work, let me know. We can test some things out if I don't know the answer already. And yeah, thanks for watching this video to the end. I'll see you in the next one.